stay awake for this? Maybe. I was going to say, too many late nights in Geneva.
Well, a very good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this afternoon session here at Building Bridges on Can Data Save Us from Greenwashing? This is a topic very close to my heart because I'm Matthew Vincent and I'm the editor of Project Publishing at the Financial Times, and that means that my project publishing team produces publications like this on responsible investing, which of course has to address this very issue of greenwashing, ESG metrics, ratings, how we deal with them, how they affect everything that we do in our jobs as journalists, your jobs as investors, asset managers, bankers, advisors, consultants, all trying to get to the same end point of sustainability in what we do, but having to negotiate so many different and difficult obstacles in terms of data, regulation, and just the interpretation of these things. So I'm very pleased to say that we've got a panel here who are far better qualified than any journalist to address these issues. I will introduce them briefly. Sitting next to me here, I have Philip AB, who'll be known to many of you as the CEO of RepRisk. On the other side, I have Christoph Braun, who is Equity Investment Director at Capital Group. Then on the end of the panel this side, we have Patrick Schmucki, who's co-head of Climate and Sustainability here at KPMG in Switzerland. Karen Wilson, who is an expert in impact investing, sustainability, who teaches many institutions and advises lots of companies on both impact and sustainability. And on the other end of the panel, Damien Payatskis, who is the head of sustainable and impact investing at Barclays. And so someone who's very familiar with all of these issues. What I'm going to do, I'll tell you the format. I'm going to ask each of our panelists in a moment to give a one-sentence response to the question, can data save us from greenwashing? Then I'm going to let them have a little bit longer to talk about how data, ESG and greenwashing fits into their day-to-day work. Just sort of 4 or 5 minutes on that. Then we'll open it up for questions. I'll put some questions to the panel, and then I'm going to start to take questions from all of you in the audience. All you have to do is just raise your hand. I'll bring you in. You press your button, speak into your microphone, ask your question, and I'm hoping we're going to have quite a big debate. I'll start off with my particular take on this before inviting all of our panelists to give theirs. I suppose the first thing I would say is, do we need saving from greenwashing? Well, yes, we do. And if we need a reminding of that, the regulators are providing that reminder. Everyone is aware of what BaFin thinks about greenwashing and needing to be saved from it. And of course, in the US, the SEC as well as BNY Mellon has found to its cost. The question, though, is data the answer? I'm constantly told that data, artificial intelligence and machine learning is the answer to everything. You can in fact replace financial journalists with artificial intelligence. They can write company earnings stories far better than anyone at the FT, apparently. But I've got one big problem with data, and it's this. There's too much of it, and it varies hugely. I was most taken with a comment by the head of Alphaville at the FT, who found that the ESG ratings of 6 leading ratings agencies had correlations between them that ranged between 0.38 and 0.71, which is massive. To put that in context, the difference in credit ratings between the major ratings agencies is 0.92. So my starting point is data might be able to save us from greenwashing, but we'll need to decide what data we're talking about. Anyway, let me ask our panelists to give their one-sentence answers. I'm going to start with Philip. Can data save us from greenwashing?
Well, of course, I would love to say that yes, can data save us from greenwashing? Yes, because we actually do artificial intelligence. We even do machine learning that few people in ESG. But the fact is, the real answer must be no, because the question is first what you want to achieve. And then you have to look whether you can find the data, and these ESG ratings are the perfect example. I mean, what do ESG ratings stand for?
Exactly. We'll come on to more of that shortly. Let's go to Christoph now. Your one-sentence answer.
I think it will. Obviously, it won't be the quantity of data that will be determined, but the quality of data. And I agree, it needs global standardization of the data that we all together, the investment chain, will look at.
Thank you. And standardization, again, I think is a topic that will come up. Let's go to Patrick now.
So can data save us from greenwashing? My sense is going to need to be absolutely not. Because
that's very clear.
It's because clearly we need to look at the way we gather the data, the way we manage the data, the way we use the data, the way we interpret it, and that all needs to come together from several stakeholders who use this data.
Thank you, Patrick, for that very emphatic answer. Let's go to Karen now.
So I would say yes and no, similar to other panelists. Yes, if it's really decision-relevant data. No, if it's just a bunch of data to show that you have data, and irrelevant data. So at the end of the day, it should be about data for decision-making.
Indeed, thank you. And Damien, your
Sure.
opening position.
So my answer also is no. Actually, let me go a step further. There's a lot of no's on the panel. I think actually the focus, or too much focus on data at the moment, may actually exacerbate greenwashing, and even more so, or more of a problem, may actually stop us from putting more catalytic capital into the social and environmental problems that we have.
That's a very good point. What I'm going to do now is I'm just going to ask each of our panelists just to speak about the whole problem of greenwashing and data and metrics in their sort of day-to-day work and the problems that they encounter and what they do when they encounter them. Starting off with Philip. And Philip, could you just, for those of our audience who aren't as familiar with what your company does, tell us a bit about it.
With pleasure. So RepRisk is a ESG data science company. We don't call it an ESG data provider because we're very proud of the fact that we actually do data science, which has two elements. One element is that we do what Matthew called artificial intelligence with a certain skepticism. As a more specifically, we do machine learning. I come to that. And the other part of data science is that we then build metrics for different needs. Okay, but what sort of data do we actually collect? And we are a specialized ESG data company. This means we only look at ESG issues or ESG risks. So we look at things like cutting down the rainforest, child labor, corruption. And because we look at these issues born out out of a due diligence service originally, back in 2006, long time ago, a due diligence service for banks about the client relationships and approval for transactions. We look at what is available from outside of companies. So if you think of corruption, no company will write in the sustainability report how much facilitation payments they had basically to pay to get a certain deal. If you think of labor issues, if you think of pollution, etc., then basically this is not the sources you need actually to identify and assess these ESG issues and ESG risks. So for that reason, since 2006, when we started the due diligence service, actually we looked at information from outside of companies, and here I mean media. When we started in 2006, more than 60% of the documents, as we call it, actually came from print media, online media, etc. In the meantime, this is about 20 to 22%. And then all sort of stakeholders like NGOs, think of Greenpeace, but also very important governmental sources. For example, in China, there are more than 4,000 environmental protection agencies at the local level, and the challenge is to get information when they publish it, because there are laws in China that say that you have actually to publish environmental violations of companies, but it's not necessarily in the interest of these environmental protection agencies, because they also depend on these companies for value creation. So you have to be very fast, and you need partners to do this work. Then we look at regulators, think tanks, etc., these sort of information. And we specialized in identifying and assessing these ESG issues. And because we have done that since 2006, we collected a lot of these text documents and we label them. And labeling is what actually the machine learning empowers. So we have for each issue, being human rights violation, bribery, biodiversity, adverse impacts, we have thousands and thousands of documents in actually 23 languages, so 1,000 each language, that we can feed then to the machine to see patterns. And this way, basically, we can find these documents, about 500,000 documents we look at on a daily basis, the documents that are really that really matter. And that's basically what you said, Karen. The question is, what are the pieces of information that allow you to take better decisions? So we look at these documents that really matter, severe forms of forced labor, etc., associated with companies, but also with infrastructure projects and also with countries. So that's our business. Now, regarding greenwashing, we love to say that we specialize to help investors, but also banks, insurances, supply chain managers, etc., to see whether companies walk the talk. But I think it's very important in the current status of the ESG discussion that we look at greenwashing also from a perspective when is actually greenwashing in terms of a discrepancy to what companies promise. And I think what's currently happening, and that's my big concern, is that many companies are forced to make grandiose, maybe that's not English, great promises, thank you. For example, regarding climate change and carbon emissions. I mean, if you're CEO of a big company, basically you have to be on all these panels and say, yeah, we cut by this percentage by this year. You have to do it. And anyway, why shouldn't you do it? Because you're not in charge anymore when these years are reached. And if you're still in charge, like you, then it's a bit like governments, what you see now, that you can then step back and say, the circumstances have changed. There's a war now, energy, security, and all that stuff. So this worries me currently much more when it comes to greenwashing, that the great pledges and decisions are made, also investment decisions based on such pledges, and this ultimately means as a huge capital misallocation. So greenwashing, if you had asked me 5 years ago, I had only said, well, greenwashing is all about getting better data, of course, our data as an example, but not only, and then actually see whether the companies walk the talk, and then actually the world becomes a better place because you can make companies accountable. That's, by the way, our company mission. But nowadays, I think this problem with the pledges and that no company basically can really say what they really think, and also this illusion, in my opinion, that investors can really change the economics and the business model of companies. I mean, if you're a pension fund, you really believe you can go to BP and fundamentally change the BP's business without basically endanger the profit and the dividends you depend on. So this is something I'm very, very worried about, that ESG gets a bad name because we go too far, in the sense that we expect from investors things they cannot deliver, that maybe then governments and regulators should deliver.
That's what we'll come on to in our discussion.
Perfect. And then I say later something about ESG ratings. But
We'll bring that up too.
But I think I had my 5 minutes, right? Yeah.
Made very good use of them. Thank you, Philip. We will come back to that whole business about ESG and bad name. But I'd like to now get Christoph's...
Would you like to have the microphone?
Thanks. I'd like to now get Christoph's view. Being an equity investment director, it's a different perspective, I'm guessing, but it's full of very, very sort of difficult decisions on a daily basis.
It is, and I think ESG is just another challenge that we add to a very challenging environment anyway. So, but let me take a step back, and I'll keep it short. Who the asset manager is that is represented today on this investment sort of value chain. But Capital Group is a global active asset manager. And was founded, it won't be a history lesson, I promise, but was founded in the deep depression in the US in 1931. So 91 years, I think, of investment experience. And today we still do one thing, and we try to be very good at that one thing, and that is long-only investing, predominantly in equities, fixed income, and multi-asset. We do have today 2.2 trillion US dollar under management. Now, why am I bringing up those numbers? Because I think size is important in the context of ESG, proxy voting, being active. So having a chair around the table when you discuss those issues and challenges with companies. And I think what is also important, we are employee owned. And so I think that helps us to be more long-term oriented. And I think, again, that is a very, very important characteristic when you also face things like greenwashing and trying to improve companies and this planet. Now, let me maybe just do a few opening remarks and maybe even go back to what my colleague said. I think from an asset manager perspective, there are two very important aspects to greenwashing to consider. And I think the first one is a concern around greenwashing related to asset managers themselves. So I think what we observe is that it is really important as an asset manager to be clear on what you do with regards to ESG. To be transparent. Transparency is key. So be very clear what objectives as an asset manager you are trying to achieve when investing in companies, when having strategies, be it fixed income, equities, or multi-asset. And be very clear to your asset owners, your clients, what you don't do. So set expectations. By setting expectations, you get rid of that deliberate or undeliberate, let's call it greenwashing in ESG. So I think that is a very important first point. Now, I think we all know that greenwashing is nothing new. It has been around. It's not a new concern. And what is interesting, we are doing a yearly global ESG study, and we would ask global investors around ESG topics, and greenwashing is definitely part of it. And interesting is that this year, the perception of greenwashing amongst global investors has actually decreased. Now, by how much has it decreased? And actually, less than half of all global investors believe that greenwashing is less of a risk and less omnipresent within the industry. Now you're going to say, what is less than half? So that number came down from 57% when we asked the question last year to 48%. But 48% is still a flagging high number, right? So, and that for me raises a very big issue. There's a lack of trust, there's a lack of transparency, there's a lack of visibility, so there's a lack of credibility for the asset management industry, and so that's something we need to restore. Now, I think what we should definitely discuss today is where's that coming from? And so if we go back, and I think we're all familiar with the SFDR, the Sustainable Finance Disclosure Regulation, that actually should be reducing greenwashing, sorry. And if we look around today, we actually realize it has exactly achieved the opposite. And why is that? Because that regulation is, and we heard it, very vague. It leaves a lot of room to interpretation. And that's why I was saying it's quality, but also a global standard. So obviously, you know, there's a lot of Article 8 funds around, but I think it's very confusing because everyone has a lot of room of maneuver to interpret the Article 8 framework in the way they want and use different methodologies to get to a very different result. And I think that's very frustrating today for asset owners and clients. And we've seen some downgrades. We're not going to drop any names today, but I think from that regard, Capital Group takes a very different, a more conservative approach, and we can talk about it later. But let me just maybe finish with my second concern around greenwashing, and that is by companies that we invest in. And so what we would observe is that with a growing focus on ESG and sustainable investing, there's a lot of, and when I say companies, listed companies that I follow, they have been working very hard to sell their sustainability credentials. And I can tell you, not all of them are living up to the bold claims and statements that they are making, obviously. So there's also a lot of greenwashing there. And so what I would say to that is that when you as an asset manager invest in companies, don't take everything for granted. Ask questions, be critical. Go back and do your homework before headlines. And so try to make sure that when you collect your own data, and I'm not saying third-party data is irrelevant, I think it opens your horizon, but also do your homework, collect your own data, and then not just collect data, but analyze it and make sure you understand it. Because that is creating a debate with the asset owner, but also with the companies that you invest in. And I think the most important thing about data is to have those richer conversations, and that could get us out of this greenwashing.
Do your own research, do your own homework.
Do your homework first.
Let's go to thank you. Let's go to Patrick now. If I remember correctly, your first answer to the question, can data save us from greenwashing, was absolutely not. But tell us why you think that, and what in your sort of day-to-day work has led you to that conclusion.
Sure, happy to do so. So I mean, we as a Big Four firm, we sort of see both sides. So we would help firms kind of get ready, for example, for regulatory requirements like SFDR or CSRD, which are about increasing the transparency of the institution with regard to its sustainability performance, if you will. But at the same time, also we sort of take the view of the investor. The investors who are increasingly requesting an increased trust in these numbers, and they're looking for external assurance of these numbers. And I mean, I think there's two main points that concern me on the side of kind of those who provide the data, or those who report data, and those who use it. So those who report data is, I mean, ultimately, the view is clear that non-financial reporting will need to sooner rather than later be reported to the same standard as financial reporting. With the same, using the same robust processes, controls, the same governance, assignment of same responsibilities, use of similar systems, all that sort of thing. And I mean, in that regard, it is still a bit concerning the standard that we see in many firms today. So it's still quite early. They're definitely first movers in this part, but also when we look at the providers, for example, of accounting systems, they're also just sort of, we see them just moving and actually providing scalable solutions to do that. So on that part of the kind of equation, a lot of work needs to be done. Governance is absolutely crucial. Somebody needs to be in charge of internal as well as external data to make that point. I absolutely agree with that. There is still a long journey ahead. And you're looking at the extremely tough requirements of CSRD. I'm sometimes getting a bit worried. And now maybe coming to the other side. The users of the data. So something that concerns me is still how simple the view of the public or the investor is on kind of the kind of ESG data in general. It is usually completely taken out of context. In traditional financial analysis, nobody would ever in 1,000 years come to the idea that the profit of a firm or the PE ratio of a firm is in any way a reliable piece of information that will predict the future success of a firm. And it's the exactly same with non-financial data. You still got to do the work. You still got to dig in, understand the data, see it in context, do your own analysis, form your own opinion, and this is even more important in sustainability, and it's never going to change, all right? So there will never be the absolute definition of sustainability. There always needs to be that context, and to be honest, the general, let's say, cultural context isn't really favorable in that regard. So like occurrences like cancel culture and that, I don't observe that the public seems to be willing or ready to have this differentiated discussion around why a certain firm, while it may operate in a industry which might not be necessarily seen as sustainable, can still make a very convincing and plausible and credible transition into a sustainable future. And there is just no margin of acknowledgement that I see for that. So I think definitely firms need to become better and clearer at not only reporting information, and that's actually also something that Christoph said. It's not only about reporting; it's about communication. Communication is going both directions. It's an incredibly powerful tool to engage with stakeholders, with investors in a constructive dialogue, using facts and not just opinions. But the reason why it's not done is that the data is not sufficiently robust right now, and often within the organization it doesn't really have it doesn't have that strategic relevance where firms sort of go out, so these are our KPIs, they're strategically relevant because of that, and that's why we do this. That's not the dialogue that I see. And so that's, I think we need to kind of address both sides to really achieve a more kind of constructive use of data and address this greenwashing issue.
We do, yeah, no, and very, very good point about this gulf between the standards and standardizations in non-financial reporting, financial reporting. I mean, how can we expect public perception to be better if we don't have the same standards? Let's turn to Karen though now. I mean, you both teach and advise companies. What do you say to them in terms of best practice or the way to address greenwashing controversies, difficulties?
Well, first of all, I don't think it's just greenwashing. It's also impact washing and SDG washing and all kinds of washing. Maybe that's why the greenwashing has gone down, because we have a lot of other things we can blame as well. And I just want to start actually with a disclaimer. There's a typo on the slide. I left OECD at the end of June. However, I worked with OECD for over 12 and a half years, so like my colleagues there, I love data. So please don't blame the data. Data is great. I studied applied mathematics undergraduate at a leading technical university in the US, and I learned that data is science. There's an exact answer. Then I went to a leading business school and I learned that actually data is an art and you can make data show what you want. And that's really what we're seeing today. And so, you know, I've really learned to check sources and be careful about what the data is, make sure at least you're transparent when you're using data. So that would probably be one message that I have, that, and it goes back to what you were saying, Christoph, that companies and investors need to be very clear about what their impact goals are, what their approach is, what their methodology is, and be transparent around that. Not everyone can be held accountable for every single thing. It's what are they trying to do, and are they credibly making progress in achieving that? You know, we were talking about standards, and the good news is there are a lot of standards. Everyone says, well, we need more standards. Actually, we have a lot of standards. Maybe we don't need more standards. We have a lot of voluntary standards, and they're very important. They play an important role in the market, but we probably have too many. And so in my work at OECD, I also was involved in the impact management project Structured Network, in which we were working with other standard setters to try to build coherence between the existing set of standards, but also, and probably more importantly, build convergence between the different standards. And actually, one of the byproducts of that was the collaboration in the eventual merger of SASB and IIRC into the Value Reporting Foundation, which of course, alongside CDP, became part of the ISSB. We love acronyms in this space, so I assume everyone in the room speaks the same acronyms, otherwise we'll provide a glossary at the end. So apologies in advance for that. So there are a lot of these voluntary standards, and they're really, really important. However, the teeth really come with the mandatory standards. But again, from my many years at OECD, what I've seen with standard setting, it's a dance between when the public sector should take the lead and when the private sector should take the lead. And often in new markets, actually the private sector has to take the lead because they know the market, they're out there on the front line, and they're sort of discovering what's working and what's not. It's not perfect, but they're learning and they're developing things. And the public sector is usually a bit behind the curve, and so they need to learn, they need to work with the private sector, but at some point the public sector needs to step up front. And that's really sort of where we are now and what we're starting to see, and that's very important because it puts teeth behind this. But I think the fact that we have all of these voluntary standards that more and more companies and investors are complying to is helpful, but it's also creating confusion, but we'll get to that more in the panel. And that we're having more and more mandatory standards and requirements is important. But we also don't want the public sector to get too far ahead, We want smart regulation. We don't want lots of regulation. We want regulation that makes sense. It's like data. We don't need more data. We just need to figure out what the relevant data is that we need to make decisions.
Very good, thank you very much. And we will absolutely come on to that topic of smarter regulation in our questions. Let's let Damien, though, give us his particular view.
Thank you, Matthew. Yeah.
Barclays, obviously, you've been focusing on this particular area. Tell us about how it affects your day-to-day work.
Absolutely. So if you start from my context, the perspective to bring to the panel, it's from a private banking perspective, which means that part of my role is sitting down with families and family offices, our clients, individual investors, to help them understand and navigate the system and think about how they want to invest. But also, I don't run any money, but sitting down with the investment teams who are using data to inform their investment decisions about individual companies, but also the fund managers that we might bring onto platform. So let me come in with a little bit of that perspective and context. And I do see this as two topics. One is greenwashing, the other is data. And then obviously the interplay or intersection between the two is what we're interested in. And if I'm thinking about it, let me start from the greenwashing perspective from where I'm sitting in the investors. So we also like data, or I like data as well. Thought it very interesting to collect data around investors' interest. And these are probably different investors than the ones that you're surveying, Christoph. We've been supporting research over the last 8 years. Last year that we had about 300 families, 33 countries, average net worth, $833 million. So a unique data set in terms of the type and the nature of the investors we're talking about. And we did ask questions about greenwashing. Interestingly, we had a higher one, and it was an issue, right? 76% of families said that they were interested or concerned about investing in a greenwash investment. 42% said that was going to be one of the critical issues over the next 5 years. So it may be a different perspective to bring in there. But beyond just observing the problem, what I thought was interesting, we had last year a question around, well, what would give you confidence around an investment not being greenwashed? And you think regulation, or maybe industry bodies or alliances. Bad news. Those are at the bottom three. So apologies if any of you in the room are involved in those initiatives. That is not going to give confidence to our families and family offices. What is going to give them confidence, they said, was three things. One was robust and high-quality impact measurement and management processes. Secondly was being able to trust the investment manager or the investment house in terms of what they're doing. And lastly was a track record of impact, delivering impact performance. All three of those were sort of the top three. Now, you'd say, well, actually, all of those rely on data, so why in your opening statement you say, not going to trust that? What's the issue? Well, I think there's three reasons, really, why we're not going to be able to rely on data as it stands. First is that the data is imperfect, and I think we have to accept that. But when you're looking at it, ultimately, in terms of data quality, right? You think about data quality, accuracy, consistency, conformity, uniqueness, timeliness, validity, all of those issues around what makes high quality data. And you take any one of those in our space and you say, well, timeliness, right? There's a different data provider or data science organization in the market at the moment collecting data. They're saying, please report on the last 12 months of your performance. Now that takes them 2 or 3 months to actually produce, collate, clean the data, and then publish it. And then that's supposed to be good for the next 12 months. Well, let's add that up. That's over 2 years in the worst case scenario that you're looking at data that you're trying to make an investment decision on or you're trying to judge a company around, that it could be out of date. And therefore, you're saying, well, actually, how confident can we be in the data that we have today? And by the way, I think there's an interesting question that you brought up around financial data versus non-financial data. And I think we're often applying a much higher level or standard expectation around non-financial data than what we do to financial data, but it just become accepted that all financial data is good, which I think we know is not. So that's the first issue. But even if the data was perfect, let's assume that the data is perfect. The second issue is that it's not always used. Going back to the organizations you referenced, the regulators and the enforcement agents didn't show up because they didn't have data. They showed up because they weren't using it. I remember sitting down with somebody leading one of the teams in 2015, and I was really impressed, actually, that the ESG data engine they were building, the different data providers they were pulling together, the way that they were thinking about consolidating, cleaning, making the data comparable, and making it accessible to the investment management teams, what they were doing. Now, that was actually they probably started before that, 7 or 8 years ago. When the enforcement agents turned up it wasn't because they didn't have the data, it was because the fund managers weren't using the data, but the implication was from the market materials that they were. So just having the data doesn't mean you're using it, and therefore we can't just assume that better data or more data is going to give us that answer. But even if you did have the data and you had the intention and you were intentional about using it, well, it doesn't mean you know how to use the data either. So we talk about data and information, knowledge or wisdom. And apologies for being a bit pedantic, but I think it's important in this case. And to some extent, even if you agree or disagree with that hierarchy, knowing what to do and how to present the data, how to communicate the data is hugely important when you're thinking about greenwashing. Let's go back to greenwashing and my clients. We use oftentimes in the industry tons of carbon per million of revenue. It's a data, something we can gather, something we can collect, we can compare. We love it. There's a financial metric attached to it. Fund managers can build portfolios and run benchmarks. How many clients actually understand what that means? Quite frankly, there's a few fund managers that I'm skeptical of as well in terms of actually being able to understand what does that mean and how to use it to inform the investment decisions you're making. So that's a third issue. Even if you have it and you want to, building on it is actually one of the critical pieces, and I think a couple people have alluded to that. So for me, in the end, if I'm thinking about it, these are data. I am hugely supportive of improving quality, reliability of the data, and transparency. But ultimately, they're raw ingredients. They are inputs into decision making and investments. And if you think about it, actually, think about this: hand the world's finest ingredients to the world's worst chef. Are you going to get a Michelin star meal? Probably not. You're probably going to get food poisoning is what you're probably going to get. And if there's a parallel there, I think that's kind of where we are with the data, the idea that we're going to give better quality to everybody and therefore we're all going to have Michelin star meals. I don't think that's the case, unfortunately, and therefore for me, data is necessary but not sufficient to save us from the greenwashing.
Thank you, Damien. I'm tempted to ask you who you think the worst chef is in terms of the greenwashing agenda, but I won't ask that question. What I am very keen to know, I was intrigued that you mentioned that survey that you did about confidence in not being greenwashed and the bottom three factors. I think you said that regulation and industry bodies were two of them. What was the third?
Off the top of my head, I think it was something about how actually it was a little bit about the communication in terms of how it was communicated that the reporting was going to give you confidence unto itself.
Well, the reason I asked that is because I now want to open this up to all of you to ask lots of questions. And one of the questions that I want to put to start it off is to do with this idea of confidence or lack of confidence or lack of trust, because ESG does not have a great reputation now, even though your own research, Christoph, showed that people were slightly less concerned. And I want to start off by just saying, what is it that has given ESG a bad name? Philip, what would you say?
Well, first of all, I think you're right. For 15 years, my friends and colleagues thought I'm a sort of tree hugger. And then finally, they know what ESG is, and 1 year later, they think it's really something ridiculous, right? And it gets a bad name. So I enjoyed one good year. I think it was in 2020. So I thought a lot, what is the reason, actually, that ESG gets a bad name? And I think, of course, there are three reasons. Number one, I said before, do companies walk the talk? This is actually something that investors, bankers, etc., have increasing good data at hand to see what companies do. The reason is we have more transparency in line with more expectations by stakeholders. And a lot of good things are happening here. I've been several times to the headquarters of Nestle, I always enjoyed it. But when I heard, actually, I think last year, that are now increasing the cocoa price instead of having another foundation, that really increase the cocoa price because they want to tackle child labor seriously. So I was thinking, wow, the world is really, really changing. And there are many such examples. That when you think of things like human rights, child labor, corruption, pollution, not necessarily depends what it is, but environment is more complicated. But especially on the S and G side, a lot of good things are happening because there's more transparency. So that's one thing that ESG gets a bad name if companies don't walk the talk, right? But here really data helps. You just have to make sure, I think as Damien said, I mean, the data should be reasoned, in my opinion, at least daily. You should have a good coverage, especially not only listed companies and private companies are extremely important as well. And then, of course, it's not enough just to cover the developed markets, but also emerging markets and frontier markets. And for this, of course, you need technology. Okay, but let's go back. That's factor number one, that ESG gets a bad name when basically people have the opinion that companies anyway do what they want, they don't walk the talk. The number two, which as I said before, I think is becoming a real big problem, is this whole thing of climate and how companies and investors can contribute to this transitioning to this great low-carbon future. And I think, first of all, for me as a climatologist, I'm actually a climatologist by training, then I was a breadless job back in the 90s, I had to go into consulting later, but I'm a climatologist, and the first thing I learned is that you have to think in a system view. So basically, what's the point if any of these investors basically can decrease the carbon intensity of their portfolio? I'm sorry, but what's the point of that exactly? I mean, look what's happening. I mean, I said Nestle does a great job. I also think Holcim, the cement producer, makes a great job. But from a CO2 perspective, when they sell basically the whole Indian business, for a lot of money, by the way, and basically can lower their carbon footprint, is there any gram of CO2 that is not being emitted? Of course not. So that's one thing, basically that you just shed assets, in the worst case even goes to private companies. And that's of course a consequence if you have this portfolio view. A portfolio view does not reflect the world except your NBIM, I mean the Norwegian Pension Fund. So this is, when we talk about things like science-based target initiative, yeah, let's be scientific and let's take the target from the scientists, but let's also be scientific in the sense that we have to think in a system view. So what is really happening in terms of private companies, other investors stepping in? And anyway, it's not up to the investors to decide whether in future we can still fly or have to use a bike, etc., and how the future economy looks like. So ESG gets a bad name because we expect from ESG investors things they cannot deliver, full stop. That's the worst thing, in my opinion.
Can I just bring Karen?
But can I come to the third point as well?
Do your third point, then I'd like to bring Karen. Yeah, Karen, do your third point.
Okay, the third thing maybe is something we really have to thank Bloomberg for finally for everyone to wake up, and that's related to the ESG ratings. I'm not against ESG ratings if you know what they stand for, and if you also understand how much methodology changes have been over the years. So if you know what an ESG rating is good for, it's a good thing, and then you can use it, it's no greenwashing. But if you don't know what it stands for, and in particular, and here we have to thank the European Union, they did something really great by making the term double materiality popular. You must understand, this ESG rating about profit, so any impact, adverse impact of ESG issues on a balance sheet and income statement, or is it actually about people and planet? And the fact is that usually most of the people that buy any sort of ESG funds, being institutional investors like pension funds that don't have time to look into all this ESG too much, but also retail investors, they buy ESG products because they believe maybe the performance is not better, but it's more or less the same, but they do something good for people and planet, and that's not what ESG ratings stand for. So here, double materiality, that's how it all starts. That when we talk about ESG, that we say what we want to achieve. And of course, if you have an ESG rating that claims that it looks at financial risks and adverse impact on the company's profit, then you should also look back and see, well, is it actually, in terms of a real product, not all this great back testing, which is all a fake. But if real products, have these products really overperformed? And of course, usually they don't, if you look at all the famous indices, etc. with the exception maybe of 2021, when there was this huge momentum regarding ESG. Okay, in my opinion, these are the three things. Company don't walk the talk, but here data helps a lot. Second, the whole question, is it actually really helpful for investors to drive this transitioning to the low-carbon economy, or is it just easier for the governments and the regulators to say, oh, you investors, you make your fees anyway? And the third thing, of course, the question is, what does ESG stand for, in particular ESG rating in terms of double materiality?
Yeah, and that understanding of what ratings mean is what's missing, isn't it? So often. Karen, your thoughts?
I think another reason that ESG gets a bad name is that the term is totally misused. Actually, I've always said, even to my colleagues at OECD that use the term ESG investing, I think that's an oxymoron. You're not investing to mitigate your risks. ESG is about compliance. It's about risk mitigation. It's very important for managing your negative externalities, but it's not an impact strategy. I led the work at OECD on impact investing, and my colleagues would always have fights with me, oh, that impact stuff, that's some small niche. And actually, at the end of the work that we did, you know, the story was actually impact is for all companies and investors to think about, both positive and negative impacts. But ESG is really a risk mitigation tool, very important, but there are also companies that proactively are trying to have a positive impact through their products and services, through their operations. And so I think we've just conflated all these terms in the market and confused people, and we've opened the door to those people that don't want any of this. The ratings, you mentioned the rating agencies, it's a mess because they all have different ratings and people can game the system, it plays into greenwashing. But you know, I think all of these things are just making it easier for critics that don't want to do this stuff to discredit ESG and impact and SDGs and whatever, and I think that's very dangerous.
Yeah, Damien, I mean, your impact investing, I remember years and years and years ago, that's what everyone used to talk about before ESG had been come up with. And one of my former colleagues, Stuart Kirk, who achieved some notoriety at HSBC, recently wrote a piece suggesting that we should split investing between those who focus on ESG as a sort of compliance screening approach and those who focus on impact, which is actively going out and seeking those assets, those companies that are doing something tangible, measurable to change the world for the better. Where do you sit in terms of, is ESG helpful as a term?
Put Stuart aside, there's a much more profound and direct view about both what he said and how he said it, and even to some extent how he explained that. Basically, he's just re-explained what ESG and impact is, but with new labels, which I think we have a different term for that, basically, as it goes. But it's an interesting point, both Stuart, or more generally, and excuse me, I want to bring you in here, actually, because to some extent the question is, who is explaining what ESG is and how are they using the terms? And to be honest with you, media oftentimes is part of that situation. You know, most of my investors, if we're coming in, their first introduction to the topic is through what it is written in the FT, in the Economist, et cetera. And to some extent, I wonder how much of that conflation that we're talking about also happens to be with regard to how is it explained. Now, we've gotten past, I mean, earlier on it was interchangeable, it was almost copy and paste, and it's, you know, ethical investing, ESG investing, impact. It was almost like they had to use as many words in the same article as possible, even interchangeably. We've improved on that, but to some extent, I still see ESG investing. I'm in agreement with you as a term. I do wonder to what extent or in what ways, in a building bridges sense, does media play a role both in mitigating that or exacerbating that risk of greenwashing in terms of investor expectations? Because remember, we're talking about greenwashing not in the big sense, but also where an end user, an end investor inadvertently or advertently thinks that they're going to get something that they don't get in reality, but part of their expectations are being set by, you know, what they're reading, not just by us in terms of the communications they're getting. Sorry, I hope I still get to talk to the FT in the future.
I can't believe you're suggesting that the media might be part of the problem. Surely not. Journalists only become a problem when they leave to join a bank. That's the way it works. No, but you make a very good point, because all of those terms were absolutely interchangeable. I mean, I remember writing 25 years ago when I was a junior reporter. Yeah, nobody differentiated between them. So I think you raise a very good point, and that is often how investors first interact with the terminology. But yes, let me bring in Christoph on this.
Yeah. Can I just make my point? I think is it not the commercial interest and aspect behind ESG that really gave it a bad name? What certain parties are trying to achieve with it. I think if we go back, what ESG stands for, it's making this world a better place, holding companies accountable for it, be smart about what we want to do and how we want to invest. And I think with it came an avalanche of different solutions, different ways of looking at it. Everyone thinks he or she is, or institutions are smarter. Everyone comes with their methodology, I think that's how we got lost the big picture of what we actually are trying to achieve, what the objectives are behind that data. So I think data is important, because if you don't have the data, you don't analyze the data, your own data, and you don't understand the data, how can you make sure that you are targeting the right objectives?
Well,
and again, objectives, and how can you be sure that if you take actions, that these are the right and efficient actions to take?
So it's an interesting point. I agree with you that if we look at it, investor interest, right? We recognize there are social and environmental problems in the world that has generated client demand to some extent or in some ways. I think there is an aspect of companies wanting, or a financial services company wanting to play a positive role in the space as well, but realistically there is a commercial opportunity there, and we are going to move into that space as financial services organizations. So then the question becomes, how do we do it? And I think two issues. One is without deep knowledge, which is I think where oftentimes you can see, or without authentic commitment to the topic, that's where the starting point of where the issues arise from. So it's not to say we cannot commercially benefit from it, or we don't want to, because our clients want to as well. They want to invest, preserve, grow wealth, and make a positive contribution to the planet. That's how we kind of see it, be it through ESG or impact. And I think the point, to some extent, is we've taken a homogeneous approach to this, as a label, whatever label you want to use, and tried to continue to apply that homogeneous view when in actuality, it's a very heterogeneous set of approaches and ideas behind it.
Very good. Can I just move on to attempting to sort of perhaps solve some of these problems? I want to go to Patrick. I mean, you alluded to having better reporting standards, or having, perhaps some sort of standardization in the way reporting is done. Is that realistic? Can that be achieved, do you think? Would that help?
Yes, it can. But we need to be realistic about what it will mean in substance. Let's just look at financial reporting right now. We have basically two global standards, IFRS and US GAAP. So even in financial reporting, we haven't achieved one global standard yet. But at least we're down to sort of a situation where at least it's a translation issue, right? But let's look deeper. So let's look at IFRS. The interpretation of the very detailed and specific standards of IFRS diverges massively even within the European Union. And in areas which are extremely central, such as the capital ratios of banks. So, I mean, it's absolutely illusionary that even for the unlikely situation that we come to a global ESG standard, it will never be interpreted consistently in the daily business. Maybe by the year 2100 or something like that, but there will always be these diverging interpretations, and that is something, and it kind of brings me back to my initial point. I mean, we will just you'll need to keep going into the details and making up your own mind, understanding interpretations, in my view, I think it just needs a bit more realistic picture in terms of the ESG, specifically ESG investing, but general. Because I just want to recap. I think what I found to be the most important statement of this conference so far, made by Philipp Hildebrand on Monday, where he said that. In terms of ESG investing, obviously, BlackRock is applying a very clear risk approach, right? And the reason they do is because they have to. They are fiduciary managers. And the reason they have to apply this risk approach is because he said like 60 to 70% of their assets are pension assets or tied assets of insurance companies. So they're like pensioners behind that. And we don't even need to start talking about impact in this context. Plus, like the majority of the assets are accumulated in a handful of European Western countries where the public pension system is almost collapsing anyway. So, I mean, I'd kind of like to know, like, which one of you would like his pension funds invested in some super sustainable project in India with a like 30% of total loss of the invested amount? I'm really wondering. I want to see some hands. Who is really in favor of that? Okay, for those of you at home in the internet, I've seen like three hands or something like that.
There were a few hands.
And just, I mean, from that perspective, we don't even need to. Impact is bound to be a niche market. It was a niche market.
See,
it will
this
continue
is what happened to me at OECD. I told
it
you.
will continue to be a niche market.
We'll take this outside.
Unless, and that is also a very important point that Mr. Hildebrand did, unless we change the regulatory and legal environment around that. Because right now we don't even need to discuss whether people would like that, because simply the law says you cannot. And I think this is kind of making sure that people understand the broader context is really important. And there's just one other thing about I want to kind of take your side of the media, which kind of was implicitly accused of spreading false information. I mean, if we're specifically talking about the retail investors, you know, who arguably are looking for those impact investments. Current investor protection regulation won't allow in 1 million years a retail investor to invest in a real impact vehicle. And if we're talking about impact in the same way that you know, everybody always, that very high standard that everybody always asking for, like real impact stuff that would happen, that would not happen unless those funds were invested. So I think in terms of the broader market, impact investing is not really something that's on the table. It's something for high net worth individuals, family offices, something like that, who are really into it, who want to put their money at risk for potentially a positive impact. But it's never. In the current regulatory environment, it will never happen in the broader market.
Well, you provoked lots of reaction there. I'm going to let Karen come in first. Then well, Damien had his hand up. I don't know whether that was to volunteer for investing in the Indian project or whether that was to make a comment. And then we have a hand in the audience, and I think we'll open it up to the audience after that. But Karen first.
Great, thank you. I mean, we can have big debates about this, and I have had big debates over the years, as I mentioned, with my colleagues. But bringing it back to standards, we have to remember that standards, we need global standards also for the reasons that you talked about. We don't need one standard for the US, another standard for the UK, another for Europe, another for Asia. And that's why the ISSB is so important. Meanwhile, the EU wants to be ahead. They want to be the lead in setting the most stringent standards around these issues. You know, but we need that global baseline, and that's what the ISSB is working on. But we have to remember that that's the minimum common denominator. These standards are always going to be the minimum common denominator. And this gets back to something that you said. I mean, companies and investors will choose, they'll have their own goals around ESG and around impact. They'll make decisions around that. They then need to measure with the data they have how they're doing on that. What they disclose, the regulation is all around disclosure. We seem to get all caught up. Suddenly, everyone's an expert on disclosure. What matters most is how companies are measuring and managing their impact. And how they're making decisions because of the information that they're getting. You're talking to your clients. That's really important. You understand what the issues are. You can then make decisions and change things. So I think we have gotten a bit too caught up in disclosure and these standards, and we just have to remember that these are the minimum common denominator. Meanwhile, the market is moving, and there are investors of all types, investors in companies of all types. Some really are focusing only on financial materiality. Some are looking at longer-term value creation, understanding that what's material changes over time. What's not material today might be material tomorrow. They're taking that into consideration. They're not regulated to do that. But there's a whole spectrum of investors and companies, and that's great. But the bulk of the money, as you said, for the reasons you said, is still you know, on one side of that spectrum.
Thank you. Damien, did you have a...
Lots of comment.
Okay.
Sorry, lots of comments. So let's open it up to the floor.
Let's open it up. Let's go to our questioner in the front row, who I was hoping would ask a question because we had a very good chat this morning.
Hello.
Please, yeah, by all means, if you'd like to introduce yourself and then address the question to whoever you wish, or if it's a comment, just make the comment.
Yes, I'm Rosa San Giorgio, and I'm leading the responsible investing journey of Pictet Wealth Management. And I wanted to just briefly comment on what you know, our colleagues here, Patrick, was mentioning. And I find it fascinating that you are assuming that an impact investment is a loss, because I believe that you can have a lot of investments that have a positive impact and have good returns. And while this was something that we could have said 10 years ago, now we have track records of investments. So if you notice, I didn't raise the hand because I don't want to lose 30%, but I'm pretty sure that if anybody is interested, we can talk about investments in India that have a positive impact with a good return. And then I wanted to go back to something that Christoph and both Christoph and Karen were mentioning regarding regulations. We're talking about smarter regulations. And you made me think about something, because you were saying that SFDR, you know, we welcome SFDR and the disclosure, but it's very vague. And this doesn't help, so we need better. And I remember, you know, the conversation that we had before SFDR with all, you know, organizations, because obviously the European regulator doesn't work, you know, in his own silos. He talks with the industry, and he talks with the banks. He talks with the wealth manager and the asset managers and asks, you know, feedback. And the feedback that the regulator receives from the industry is that don't go too much in detail. I mean, I'm now simplifying it. Don't go too much in detail. Stay high level, because otherwise it would be very difficult for us. So we have a situation in which, when asked for the feedback, we say that we want to stay high level, otherwise it will be complicated. But now we are in a situation where being too high level is complicated. So how do we solve it?
Can I maybe just take that one? I mean, first about the allegations. What I specifically said was that impact investments had a high risk of failure, not that they were a failure. And unfortunately, for retail investors, that makes all the difference. Anyway, about the regulatory point, that's actually an excellent one, and Christoph had talked about it as well. So it is true that SFDR is comparably principle-based compared to other financial market regulation, and rightly so. I mean, intentionally so, because it's an emerging topic, and the regulators want to specifically give the market flexibility to adopt it. So, and now something's happening. I've been working in regulation for like 15 years, and it's always the same. So regulation, if you want it to be, is very clear. But then firms go like, oh no, that doesn't really fit right. Oh, but this is a disadvantage. But can we do that? And can we do here? And then it all gets super complicated. And then the second line of defense, so the compliance and the legal guys, they are then in the defense versus the front, and then are asking for more clarification. So this is a process which unfolds in the same way as it has unfolded for UCITS, for AFMD, for MiFID II, even MiFID I. It's on the one hand, financial institutions want very specific globally consistent rules. So they have to be specific, but at the same time, there are issues about overregulation, and that is kind of that is a kind of perpetuum mobile that has been going on for a long time, and I think it doesn't really help the whole issue. I think the fact that the sustainable finance regulation is relatively open is actually an advantage, and that should be used by the industry as an advantage, especially those financial institutions who have invested in sustainable investing for a very long time and have built up significant expertise and can now capitalize on that, because for the first time there's like sort of a market benchmark around. But what we're observing here is simply a normal process, which I don't think it is very sensible to try to sort of change something about it, because it's just the nature of regulation.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just going to try to add something, not sort of contradict but I think, when I said we need a standard, I think we just need to give investors, asset owners, clients some more guidance, and I don't want to say I'm a friend of standardization, but because, as you said, it sort of suddenly it brings up excuses, and it says you limit your universe, and you could also make the argument by standardization, you actually only focus on the good student in your ESG class, and the objective is, as I said, I repeat myself, to make this world a better place. So if you, as an active investor, and I look at our size and I say, there are actually great companies that lack reporting because they don't have the capacity. If I go to Japan, and I focus a lot on Japan, language barriers, small and mid caps, where it's huge data disclosure issues. It's just huge gaps. Doesn't mean these are bad ESG students in the class, but and so if we bring in more standardization, but not the smart one, we get rid of companies that we could actually improve. So Capital Group's philosophy is more conservative, and so we don't invest based on exclusion, because I think if you, as a company with a size and a voice, you decide that is a bad company, and you just leave the company there, it's not going to improve. It's going to stay very bad. It's not going to give any positive impact to this world. So, and actually, someone else could come in, another activist investor with a different agenda, more profit-oriented agenda, and explore the company. So I think it needs more guidance and smart standardization so that we don't just judge by a ESG score, because we heard it's backward looking. It doesn't take into consideration all the efforts that companies are doing to improve stuff, or stuff that they actually have improved. It's very backward looking. It always focuses on controversies, but it doesn't focus on the stuff that is going well. So I think that's where we could all make a bigger effort.
Thank you. Did you have anything to add, Karen? I have two more questions.
Just very short, I was going to say that you talked about it being a process, setting standards, and indeed it is, as I also said in the beginning. But I think the international organizations play a really important role as brokers. That is the role of OECD and the World Bank and these other organizations that are providing data, they're providing voluntary standards, and they're helping to bridge between the policymakers and the private sector.
Thank you. We have two more questions from the audience. Three more, in fact. I'm going to go to the back row here first, then to the centre, then the front row. Please, ask a question, and if it's directed at any panellist, mention who that is.
I won't even dare to start with Patrick on his point. Paul McIntosh.
There you have cancel culture again.
Paul McIntosh, Sustainability Editor of the Asia Asset Management magazine. Regarding the whole issue of data saving us from greenwashing, in order to reduce skepticism among asset owners and institutional investors, how could data and mechanisms and structures potentially be used to change the behavior of particularly the sales and marketing departments of asset management firms? Because I've, based on very recent observation and conversations with asset owners, I know that they are extremely skeptical when the sales teams of asset management firms present them with with green, sustainable propositions, using the same mentality, the same mindset, the same approach, as if they were using just another marketing theme. I mean, they are forgiving of people who are reasonably humble about their level of understanding, the level of commitment of the whole organization to sustainable propositions, but they are the complete opposite when it comes to simple, sales talk, dropping in ESG terms in the same way that, for instance, tech, crypto, whatever other sales buzzword of the month is used. So is there any, assuming that the only way to change people's behavior is to incentivize them, is there a way to implant sustainability considerations deeper into that whole process?
Very, very good question. If I can sum it up, can data save us from sales teams? Who'd like to start? Christoph.
I can. I think it goes back to what I was saying, homework before headlines. It's about transparency. It's about doing your homeworks first. Challenging companies, you need data first, right? You need data, collect your own data, and that's what we do. We go back to 90 years of fundamental research. That's what we have been doing before. We collect data, and so we fact check companies. We hold them accountable for what they're saying. We're showing them, are you a leader, are you a lagger? I think, just to give you an idea how we do it, I think, and this may sound cheesy, but companies are like human beings. Every company is very different, and there's a lot of complexity coming with it. And if you just, take a one-fits-all ESG methodology, and you put the company in, very complex company, and you reduce it to a score, what does it tell you? It would make all our life much more easy, but it's much more complex than that, right? So I think what you have to come up with, and that's your responsibility as an asset manager, go back, think about what are you trying to achieve? What do you need the data for? So you start collecting data, and what we did, for example, we have our own independent ESG sector frameworks. We have more than 30 of them, and there will be more as we continue and collect data. And I think now we're sort of There's a wild west of data, and that data will become smarter. We're definitely gonna make it leaner. And so with that data, we are able to actually look at companies within sectors, because E, S, and G, it does vary substantially from one sector to another when you look at companies. So you can't just say his is an homogeneous, holistic way of looking at ESG. And so that's what we're doing. And then you approach companies, and I think data goes hand in hand. It's common language with a dialogue, an engagement that you have with companies. And I think it's a journey that you have with the end client, but also with the company. I think everyone is trying to learn how they can learn from mistakes, from data that we use, and how they can improve. But I think it goes back to what I was saying earlier, is you also have to focus on the bad students in your ESG class. You can't just focus on the good ones.
Thank you, Christophe. I'll just let Damien have
just a quick one, just to get to more questions. So I sit across from some of those sales teams. So on the receiving end, I think there is two things. One is, we talked about it, greater transparency, and back to Rosa's question, if we have asked for more leniency in terms of the level, then we have an obligation to provide more transparency around the specifics of what the actual investment process looks like and how it's being affected. And so when I think about it, there's also a responsibility we have from a guidance perspective that was brought up as well. So for us and our clients, I wrote something on sort of how do you avoid greenwashing? And there were three elements to that. The second one was actually understanding the process, not the positioning, in essence. So understanding the underlying process, what are the tools and the techniques that the investment manager is using to make the investment decisions, as opposed to what is the outcome that the portfolio just happens to be holding something today. That was one of the critical things, being able to look beneath the label that comes up. Additionally, we always talk about trust versus verify in terms of, fine, you can tell me that, but this is where the impact reporting and the data actually makes a big difference. But even if we tell a manager, there are, a joke about vanity metrics. You can tell me what does this mean, but so that tells me what's happened in the portfolio. So what does that mean? Now what are you going to do about it? And actually challenging investment managers to think through those second and tertiary ideas helps to understand people who have integrated sustainability into an investment process versus the person with the green tree on the top of their deck. And ultimately, actually, from an investor standpoint, a lot of it is inside out. Because so much of sustainability, at least for our clients, is personal. What are our values? What are the things that we want to see in the world? How do we want our capital to affect the world or not affect the world? Then starting inside out then actually makes it easier to go, well, do I want to talk to this investment manager or not, even before they get in the door as such. And apologies, I can't talk about it from the sales side, but the transparency, I think, could be massively helpful. And to some extent, that is what the regulation is seeking to do. And it may not be there yet, but it's the first round as well. We actually are just writing something on how to still use labels even if they're not perfect yet for investors, because there's a lot of value in that. Challenging somebody, why are you an Article 8 fund? What would make you an Article 9 fund? Why would you drop to an Article 6 fund? You can still use some of that, even if the label itself isn't immediately transparent.
Thank you, Damien. We've got two more questions, so I'm going to try to fit them both in. Let's go to the center of our audience, first of all.
Thank you very much also for the very engaging discussion, and maybe to agree on something with Patrick, I do think we definitely need more regulatory support in making asset classes available to retail and private investors, because I think that's independent from sustainability, something that helps with scale. I guess my question, and I think Damien started partially answering my question, but I'm with UBS Global Wealth. My name is Antonia, and I guess the work that I do with private and retail clients to a certain extent, I feel that they've actually been the ones holding me and our team accountable and not the regulator. So, 10 years ago, an exclusion-only strategy would have flown. 5 years ago, maybe. Nowadays, you have a conversation on exclusions, and clients are like, what are you talking about? The world has moved on. You should have moved on, right? So I challenge the credible financial institutions in this room to think, when SFDR came 2 years ago, yes, you now have to do the paperwork. Chances are your strategies were already there. So I wouldn't necessarily think we need to wait for the regulator to help us get on a good point. But I guess my question was more on the investor education side, right? Because I think we all realize the basically the challenges with ESG data and broader data overall, I'm not entirely sure investors are well equipped to be able to challenge us on that, which means that very often the conversation is, well, here's what we do. We source data from these 10 different providers and we aggregate it in-house. An investor cannot really relate to that message, I feel. Maybe the sales teams can, I cannot. So I wanted to ask maybe some of the asset managers on the panel or some of you that have seen good practice in terms of how we can equip investors, sales aside, to actually challenge us on some of those practices of how we use data.
Okay, how can we better educate investors? Who'd like to take that one? And quite short answers because I want to get one last question for the end of the session. Who'd like to start us off?
There must be an asset manager. I can't.
Oh, is indeed. Okay, well, it doesn't have to be an asset manager. Why doesn't Christoph go?
Right? It's a very good question. Fortunately, I don't talk to the end clients, but I can see your challenge. I'm still reflecting what sort of my best answer would be. So I'll try to come in, but I don't have an answer at the moment.
It doesn't have to be an asset manager,
first.
somebody who's seen good practice, I guess.
Damien, your thoughts?
So it's interesting because obviously MiFID II is supposed to address that as well, right? But we'll save that topic for a different piece. But that is, again, a regulation seeking to do it, and whether or not it's going to or not, I think still to be seen. I think there's two things that are critical, and unfortunately these are not going to be groundbreaking. One of them, there's a lot of work to do to educate internally as well in terms of the language and the terminology, because I think that's the starting point for all of us in terms of our colleagues understanding this, because there is still a lower level of knowledge probably than what it should be. And that's an ongoing process in terms of bringing people up to speed so that it's easier for them to address the questions that clients have. That's not to answer your question directly, but actually having Salesforce or bankers or advisors understand the terminology with a much deeper level than they've had to thus far, I think is going to be one of the critical pieces. And that's just basic, to your glossary point, just basic terms. When to use one versus not when to use another. And the other thing is, from what I've seen, and actually other banks as well that do it is, and again, this is probably more private individuals. Now, I do think fiduciary duty is broader probably than what has been presented before, and actually Patrick Odier talked about it as well earlier in the day, in terms of the wider sense of fiduciary duty. I think getting people to articulate, to some extent, where their interests and boundaries are is something that we have not done before. In the same way that we've not invested for impact or considered impact or ESG historically, we are at the next stage of actually eliciting those things from clients. I think we have a lot to learn from, for example, philanthropic efforts, not because of the philanthropy aspect of it, but because you're looking at how people are engaging around what family values are, what their purpose is, how they want next generation to be investing, and actually the drivers around it. So broadly, I see it as two ways. One, family comes in and says, we care about our capital, we want to wealth and grow it, and we're concerned about what impact it has on the world. So there's a starting point of a conversation versus we care deeply about this issue. How can we use our capital most effectively to address it? And that's a starting point to sort of frame conversations that you have thereafter to say, well, we have these products or we don't have those others. I'll stop there. Happy to speak later, though.
Good. Yeah. No, go ahead. We catch up later. I just want to say, I'm not an asset manager, but we serve 500 clients, and among them, I think all the big asset managers and also many small ones. And the one thing, just as a service provider, that I've seen so often is that asset managers just buy data. They don't know what to do with it. That's a fundamental problem. And this session is about greenwashing in data. So I think the first step is for every asset manager and everyone else to actually say, what do they want to achieve? And if some asset managers come to the conclusion, like BlackRock, we heard it on Monday, that they just want to look at the ESG risk side, financial materiality, perfect. Then collect the corresponding data. But if you want to achieve something else, define first what you want to achieve. So it's not the data, in my opinion, that is a problem. It's actually that it's unclear what has to be achieved.
So the objective. Let's take one last question.
Yes, thank you. We'll be brief. Marcel Fernandez from UBS, asking the question about ESG ratings. We know that the greenwashing and all the problems that the ESG reputation is having today is also part of the lack of coherence and convergence, to come to your point, Karen. maybe looking to the future and maybe on the brighter spot, how far are we from this convergence, coherence? Are we going to have that soon that help us to have more transparency conversation with our investors?
Will we achieve convergence, Karen?
By 2030? 2050.
Popular dates, yeah.
I have never seen, I've been involved in this space for a long time, and I've never seen things move as quickly as they have in the last 2 years. So I'm very optimistic, but at the same time, these things take time. But these organizations are now working together, they're talking together, and I think they're seeing it's also in their best interests to converge, merge, whatever that might end up being. So watch this space.
But I mean, convergence for what? I mean, convergence on CO2 reporting, yes. But convergence, anything else, doesn't make any sense. I mean, does someone in the United Arab Emirates have the same wishes as someone in America, someone in Norway? It doesn't make sense at all. And especially wealth management gives me hope, because in wealth management, you talk to people and they have certain ideas about child labor, about corruption, about climate transition. And that's what you have to serve, to basically that they can achieve their goals. But there shouldn't be convergence in ESG, because everyone has a different objective.
And I wanted to end on that very optimistic remark from Karen, but you had to go and complicate matters, didn't you? Because it is a very complex issue, as we have discussed for the past 90 minutes. And I'm very sorry that we've reached the end of our time. I know that there were probably more questions and lots more things that our panelists would like to say. I said at the beginning that I'd ask all our panelists at the end if they had any different answer to the question to the one they gave at the very beginning of the session, and I'm guessing the answer is not really. No, so I think we know where we are. I think we know where the challenges lie. I think we know that there needs to be a better understanding of what the data should be used for, what the objective is. Fundamentally, there needs to be an understanding that we all have to do our work, have to do our homework. We can't just outsource these decisions and these processes to other people and expect everything to turn out okay. I've learnt that, and I wholly agree with this, that the media has a big part to play in this as well. So we'll be producing more of these responsible investing supplements. I'd just like to say a massive thank you to all of you for coming along, taking part in this session, asking your questions. I'd like to thank all of the sponsors who've made this possible, and I'd like to thank every one of our panelists for being so thought-provoking and passionate, because that fills me with hope that we'll get to the right place. Perhaps not by 2030, but anyway. My thanks go to Patrick, to Philip, to Christoph, to Karen, and to Damien. And I hope to see you all next year with progress made. Thank you all very much.
Everyone, we are now going on a 30 minutes coffee break in the village, and the next session recommences at 4. You can take the BB Connect app to see the full schedule and pick up your next session. Thank you very much.